All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Rollinda Thomas, and I'm a friend of Dr. Mongkuo and one of the teachers here. I happen to teach art education, and I happen to believe in activism in education, trying to see what are some things that we can do in the arts or in education to hopefully improve people's quality of life. Now then, of course, we want to be creative and we want to be thoughtful. Many times in art, what we try to do is bring out people's critical thinking skills about a range of topics, including social topics. And one such social topic that's very important to people all over the country and literally all over the world is the subject of HIV/AIDS prevention. Now, this is a personal topic for me because I know people who are living with HIV/AIDS, people that I care about, or people who have passed away from it. And so it's a situation that can touch many people's lives. Now, once again, if we can raise awareness, hopefully we can improve people's health, we can save lives, and we can improve the quality of people's lives. And we can hopefully dispel some misinformation or myths that are out there. Now, that was the intent of a research project that we happened to do here last spring with our art students, art and music students, and other students who just happened to be in art classes, even if they weren't technically artists. And we happened to call that Positive Visions. And this was done as a collaboration with several of our colleagues, Mr. Shane Booth, Jonathan Chestnut, Denise Payton, who is our choir director, myself, and also Dwight Smith. And these are all arts and music teachers. Now, the problem that we wanted to address, of course, Dr. Mongkuo has mentioned to you before, that the human immunodeficiency virus happens to lead or is linked to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome happens to be a situation in which your immune system can be attacked and can be weakened. And so it's not so much AIDS that causes a person to pass away, but that it weakens a person's immune system, and then other diseases or other infections can be you're not able to fight them off. And so that ultimately becomes the danger. So AIDS has affected at least 1 million Americans now, about 1 million Americans, according to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, which is in Atlanta. Now then, right now, African Americans as a group comprise about 13% of the American population. But in terms of HIV/AIDS patients, they account for about 49%. That's almost half around the country, and that's hugely disproportionate. And so the question is, and all the work that you see here in this presentation is by our students, the question is, why is this happening, or what can we possibly do about this? There are a number of surveys that happen to speak to this disparity. And so the question was, what can we do to shed some light on this? So one strategy that we're looking at is possibly trying to increase awareness of some of the risk factors and some of the preventive measures that people might take. Research seems to suggest that a lot of people may be aware of preventive measures, but for whatever reason, they're not taking them. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to address in the research. So we're hoping that we can decrease or hopefully eventually end the spread of infection. Now, in our study, 77 students here at Fayetteville State University happened to participate. They were wonderful sports, and they were very honest in their anonymous surveys. We protected people's information. That was the important thing, to make sure that people's privacy was sacrosanct. And we were investigating 3 things. Number 1, people's knowledge about HIV. Number 2, their attitudes towards people who have HIV. And number 3, their personal choices regarding risk factors or risky behaviors. Now, there were 2 groups of students. Those who there was one group that chose to participate in creative works regarding HIV. The idea was, we were hoping to see, could the arts or could the immersion in the creative process happen to help raise awareness about HIV? In other words, when a student, even if that person is not technically an artist, when a person is deeply engaged in a project and they have to think deeply about it, they have to use their critical thinking, they have to create a project, whether that's a written work, if that happens to be poetry, if it happens to be music, if it happens to be a painting, if it's a computer art, whatever they are most comfortable with. when a person is engaged in that product, oftentimes they're thinking deeply about the subject matter. And so the question was, when people are engaged in the creative process about this subject matter, does it help raise their awareness? Does it help change some of their attitudes, for instance? So we had two groups, those that chose to participate in artistic productions and those who chose not to. And there's no penalty for anybody choosing to do so or not do so. That was their choice. That was the important thing. So at the beginning, everybody took a survey. Then they happened to take part in an art project about HIV or a music project about that. And then they could take the survey a second time and we would see if there were any changes. All right, some of our students, of course, chose not to participate in the activities. Welcome. And when they concluded, all the students once again took what we would call a post-survey. The post-survey is something that we look at to see, has there been any change in people's attitudes? Now, the results were not statistically significant, which means in statistical circles that we cannot say with absolute certainty that any differences that were perceived couldn't have occurred at random. There's a possibility that this can be coincidence, some of the things that we happen to see. But there were small differences, and they were worth noting, and there were some things that happened to come out of the study that were a little bit unexpected, some of the information that we happened to get that seemed to warrant further study. So first of all, those students who did choose to participate in the production of creative works about HIV/AIDS, number one, that group of people who chose to do this happened to demonstrate slightly greater knowledge about HIV/AIDS. Number two, they showed that they tended to hold less discriminatory views toward people who were living with HIV/AIDS. And number three, they were just slightly more likely to engage in safe-sex practices. So this is kind of leading in the direction that we would hope people would go. But again, we can't say that there were large or statistical differences. Now, the study did happen to yield some interesting facts that were a little bit aside from what we were looking for. First of all, there were a few self-reported heterosexual participants who happened to state the belief that homosexual men, for whatever reason, could not avoid infection, and no matter what precautions they took, they were going to get it. And so people who tended to believe that and tended to assume that tended to yield the lowest scores in knowledge about HIV. Secondly, as you can see, they themselves happen to engage in more risk-taking behaviors than others in the group. And so it leads one to wonder if their attitudes are in some way connected. Now, our study found, and this is something that is consistent with studies around the country, studies in Norfolk, studies that Dr. Mongkuo has actually done here at Fayetteville State, and also studies done by the CDC. In this case, our study found that most participants, even when they knew more about HIV, they still tended to engage in risk-taking behavior. In my generation, I'm a child of the 80s, basically, and back then, AIDS was a very new phenomenon to many of us, and it was very scary, and there was not a lot of knowledge about it. There was a lot of myths and misunderstanding out there. And so people of this generation have a lot more knowledge than people of my generation ever did. Nevertheless, people still seem to engage in risk-taking behavior, and so the question is, why is this happening? And our surveys seem to give a little bit of insight into why that might possibly be for some people. Now, to put it in a nutshell, those possible factors tended to be these three things. Number one, prejudice seemed to play a part. Number two, people's self-esteem. And number three, I should say, power relationships with the partner, and in some cases that included the use of domestic violence. And so those were factors that seem to become important in people's decisions to engage or not engage in safe sex. Now, the most common reason that our participants happened to give for not using a condom was that they were already in a committed relationship with a regular partner. But sometimes, even if the person was not sure, that the other person was being faithful to them, they still chose not to protect themselves. So in some cases they felt or they suspected or they weren't sure if that person was in fact being monogamous. Now, for very few, and thankfully it was very few, but then again, sometimes people do not feel as comfortable reporting incidents of violence. For very few respondents, their use of force played a part in it. That there was not an option given to the young lady to be able to choose a safer alternative. And so in some cases, individuals who happen to experience violence, domestic violence or any other, may not feel that they have the power to be able to assert their right to safe-sex alternatives. So that is one potential factor. Now, I mentioned prejudice. And prejudice, it seems, paradoxically, can be a danger even to ourselves. Ignorance certainly can put us at risk, and this is certainly an excellent example of that. The prejudices of some individuals against homosexuals might lead them to believe that they don't have to take the same precautions that this other group would have to take. I'm not like them, so I'm not at risk, so I don't have to take the same precautions that they need to take. They're going to get it anyway, no matter what they do. And because I'm different, that can't happen to me. So heterosexuals who held those prejudices, in some cases, appeared to show in the surveys that they were willing to engage in very risky behavior as if that could not happen to them. So they were not taking the precautions that we would certainly suggest that everyone take. And so in some cases, our prejudices can actually put us at risk. So we would hope that everyone would take appropriate precautions, and that is one of the things that we're trying to raise awareness about. Now, certainly further study is something that I would suggest, in fact something that I intend to engage in on a larger scale, in order to try to ultimately determine the best strategies that we can find to be able to raise awareness about HIV and to be able to ultimately reduce the rate of infection, which, as Dr. Mongkuo mentioned, is a highly important topic for the African American community. Of course, we have seen the disparities with the rate of infection within this community, but also the larger community around the country, because there's really no group of people that are not affected. One group that is seeing a rise right now in the rate of HIV infection, in fact, are seniors of all, basically of all races. And the idea is that in many cases, seniors who are having unprotected sex, and they're thinking, well, I can't get pregnant, I'm well past menopause, so they're not worried about using protection. And HIV/AIDS is still a problem. Also, any other venereal disease is still a problem. So even people who are seniors need to protect. You wouldn't think that, but they need to protect themselves. Now, for more information, we always want to seek more information. We want to seek multiple sources of information. We can always look at the following websites. We can, of course, read up on it. CDC.gov is the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. You've probably heard a lot about them very recently in their efforts against the H1N1 virus. It seems like about every day we're hearing from the CDC. Secondly, the Mayo Clinic has an excellent website that has a lot of information about symptoms, about potential treatments that are out there. And of course, there's another government website called AIDS.gov, www.aids.gov. Now, each person happens to have information that happens to come from the CDC, Center for Disease Control. Now then, certainly I thank you for your time here today, and also for your support of Performing in Fine Arts, and hopefully the ability of Performing in Fine Arts to share useful and helpful information. These are some of the wonderful faculty members that happen to work on this. Denise Payton on the left, Shane Booth, myself, Dwight Smith, and also Dr. Chestnut. Denise Payton happened to do a beautiful job with working with some of her music students, some of whom wrote poetry, some of whom happened to participate. If you've never seen her meet the main attraction, they happened to go around the area and they performed at different high schools a particular song called Patchwork Quilt. which was written back in the 80s to memorialize people who had passed on from HIV/AIDS. So they happened to perform that in different areas around campus and also around our community. So they were a wonderful group in terms of participating in the arts to be able to raise awareness. Now then, I would love for you to have the opportunity to have an open discussion, and of course, as always, a respectful discussion, respectful of other people's very different opinions, which is fine, about HIV/AIDS, what our concerns might be, what myths might be out there, or what facts may be unknown. And of course, I as well open this up to Dr. Mongkuo as well, who has a lot of knowledge about the topic. He's done a lot of wonderful research about the topic.
Let me start the discussion by giving you a thought-provoking comments. My research has found that race was not an issue. Race is not the differential in terms of the spread of HIV/AIDS amongst Americans has nothing to do with race. So, in the early research, it's always very important to do this. We always look at if we see a certain group of people, be them homosexuals, or be them, not homosexual, but be them people who live a certain lifestyle, or be people who are differentiated by race, or by income, and so forth. Immediately we tend to look at it and say, well, is there something very unique about this group of people that is predisposing them to this, the spread of this disease? And that was the same thing with HIV/AIDS. In the early days, early research, what they were doing was looking at race, seeing that saw that it was spreading so rapidly amongst African Americans. They looked at race to see whether or not there's something genetically encoded in African Americans that predisposes them to acquiring this disease. Just the same thing as it was in the early days of research on criminality. Remember that? Where when they saw a high proportion of African Americans in the prison system, incarcerated, they were looking at it and saying that African Americans actually predisposed, especially the male, have something intrinsically within their genetic makeup that predisposes them to criminal behavior or deviant behavior that leads them to jail. So the same thing was going on with this HIV/AIDS. Recently, that myth was basically dispelled. HIV has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with practicing risky behavior, irrespective of who you are, irrespective of you being homosexual or non-homosexual, or black, white, Chinese, Indian, it doesn't matter. If you engage in a behavior that predisposes you to acquiring the HIV virus, you're going to get it. And so that leads us to the next stage where we are right now, with all of this wonderful work that Dr. Thomas and her colleagues have come up with, and we're still working on it. What do we have to do to prevent risky behavior on our campuses? So, with that said, and then let me also, the second thing that I said I was going to tell you, as Dr. Thomas said, I got involved in this thing because it came home. I mentioned that to you in class, right? It did come home, and I've lost members of my family, so I have another people. And that has pulled me into it. So until you lose someone, sometimes we have this tendency, which is not a good thing for humans, but until you lose someone who's very close to you, you keep on thinking that this thing is somebody else's problem and not my problem or my family problem. Okay. So with that said, anybody has any personal experience or something to share from the presentation and so forth?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Okay, I know you said about rooms and business.
Yes.
But I think it's a true factor as far as if you are exposed to HIV, it could lie domain in your body for like 10 years.
Yes, ma'am. It can anything.
Okay. 10 years to actually detect it, that it's in your system?
It doesn't necessarily take that long for it to be detected, and the good news is that that's one reason why we hope people will get tested early and get tested often. And so the idea is that the sooner we catch it, the sooner that drugs can be introduced to hopefully raise that person's chances. But it doesn't actually take that long necessarily to detect it. It may take that long before it actually develops from HIV to AIDS.
And I've seen a paper in Fayetteville, but nobody forgot about it. It came out in a local paper, I think, in Seminary. I've seen on the front page it said that cures for HIV. I mean, I don't think that's the only way I've seen it.
I surely wish. Recently there have been hopes for cures of HIV. Right now in Thailand, there's a study that's been going on. They have found a particular vaccine that seems to be working in about 1/3 of the people who have been using it. And so what they have been saying on the news very recently, this past week and so forth, is that the hope is that this will lead to an eventual, if not cure, an eventual vaccine that will keep people from being able to contract the disease. And so I believe that that's possibly what they're alluding to, that this very promising, because it's the first vaccine that's been this successful. It's still not successful in most people, but this is a huge breakthrough that can hopefully lead to people finding that ultimate cure. And so that's probably where that came from.
So that's something to that finding. Note now, it's 31%. It's great progress because it's only 31% of 31% effect on preventative disease. It's small. So we still have almost 70% unanswered questions there on how to perfect this vaccine to the level where it's going to take care of everybody. But still, it's great progress. Now, another unanswered question that the scientists are still wrestling with is how did this happen? They took 2 vaccines that was totally ineffective and combined those 2 vaccines into one and came up with this result. So the result is still baffling scientists how this happened. It's never happened before. Where you take 2, it's like taking 2 medications that are totally ineffective in curing a disease, combining them into one medication, and it came up with a cure. So that is still baffling scientists. So there's so many unanswered questions and so many stages that this vaccine has to go through before it really becomes useful. In the meantime, prevention is already a focus.
Yes, ma'am.
One of my teachers I had in the past actually worked with AIDS patients, and he said something in class that made me laugh, that made me surprised. He was talking to the gentleman in the class about carrying condoms in their wallets, because the teacher said, when you carry them in your wallet, the heat from your body over time breaks the condom down, because spermicide condoms are the best to use. So he says, gentlemen that carry condoms in their wallets for long periods of time, just in case, should make sure they take those condoms out of their wallets and replace them, because they will not be as effective if they're carried and broken down through the heat in your body.
That is excellent, excellent advice. You also can
Yes, I understand that the highest percentage of people with AIDS are senior citizens. Is that correct?
not the highest percent, at least I'll say that I haven't seen research to suggest that, but right now the largest rising group are young people.
Yes.
The largest rising people are the young ones, and that's another reason why we want to reach as many young people as possible. But it's true that it's rising at an alarming rate among seniors who really don't expect themselves to be at risk. They're really the last group of people that we might think are at risk. And in fact, I'm glad that you mentioned earlier talking about myths, because one of our students, in fact, several students, but one of our students, Stacy Robinson, happened to, in a very irreverent way, I must say, happened to point out a particular myth that used to be out there, in some cases for some people may still be out there, about HIV/AIDS, and in this case, its origins. Now then, I won't repeat exactly what it says specifically, but in quotations, having sex with green monkeys from the motherland causes AIDS. What particular myth is he speaking to in this case? And he's making fun of that myth. But what particular myth is he making fun of in this case?
That's what they said it came from.
That's what people used to say. It came from Africa, it came from the motherland, and it was identified as possibly coming from a group of chimpanzees. And so people were thinking, well, this could be a sexually transmitted disease. It's really transmitted by blood and bodily fluids. And so the myth was, oh, well, people have been out there in Africa having sex with chimpanzees. And has anybody ever seen Dave Chappelle?
Yeah.
Okay. He had this really funny monologue where he happened to make fun of that myth as well. A chimpanzee is 7 times as strong as a human being. And so the idea that you can even catch one, much less forcibly be able to have intercourse with it, is ludicrous. And he basically made that point in his own crude and irreverent way, but he made the point. And the thing is, let me ask this. Even though it was tracked to, we believe, a group of chimpanzees, how did that transmission, we believe, take place? It wasn't through intercourse. Anybody have an answer to that? And I'll ask you to check your materials, in fact, because the CDC happened to speak to that. There is a way that we do sometimes contract diseases from animals, especially tuberculosis or brucellosis, for instance. Anybody have an idea what type of contact chimpanzees could have caused this? Please share it. Please share it. Yes, ma'am. Exactly. In this area, you have hunter-gatherer societies who would, in some cases, hunt the chimpanzees for meat. And when they would handle the meat, and they're handling the blood, just like in meat packing plants. Meat packing plants around the country have problems in some cases with their workers contracting tuberculosis or contracting, in North Carolina there was an outbreak of brucellosis among some meat packers because the particular protective gloves that they were using, and the blood can be almost acidic, it can come through, you have to be very, very careful. And so they were contracting these diseases from handling the blood. And it's very likely that that is the way that this was transmitted. So it's highly unlikely that there could have been sexual intercourse of any kind. But the fact that they were killing and eating these chimpanzees, during the preparation of food, it may have passed in that manner. And so that is the belief at this time.
Another, just to add to the myth of this disease originating from Africa. Some researchers pointed out to the high rate of the spread of disease in African countries as compared to any other other countries in the world. As they would say, this thing originated from there. They are predisposed to this disease. Africans are, they call it. But what they forgot to understand was that the spread of disease had nothing to do with being an African or Africanness. It had so much to do with the African culture. And one of the key things that was not isolated in that research, which is now beginning to be understood, is that African culture allows for married people, especially men, married men, to have other partners, sex partners on the side. That is allowed. As a matter of fact, in some parts of Africa, and most parts of Africa, if your man does not have concubines, as they call it, on the side, your wife begins to look at you like something is wrong with you. Are you following me? This is deep, but it is true. And so what happened in those early days, and it still happens right now, the focus was to try to isolate would that mean the focus of all the efforts to prevent the spread of disease in Africa missed the boat. And they were not focusing on trying to identify what is Africanness, what is within an African, like African Americanness, that predisposes them to this. Instead of trying to see if there is any way that that culture can be modified or done, so something can be done about the culture. And but that nothing cannot be done about the culture because the culture has been in existence for millions of years. Okay? It's only the younger, our generation, the younger generation now, we are now reckoning with this disease and extinction, that probably people are taking more caution. So the shift came back to prevention. The efforts of Gates and all the other people are now shifted to prevention, condom use, and so forth. If you arrive at the airports of most of these countries, you see first real-borne disease, use condoms, be careful. But that never existed. The culture predisposes people. You can just imagine how it spread. It's exponential. Take my, if I have one wife and 5 concubines, in 1 week I see, or 1 month I see all those 5 concubines. One of them gives me the infection. I come home and infect my wife and take all the other concubines. Concubines are not obligated to one man. Are you following me? So I don't even have to discuss, you can put the rest together. So before you know it, the entire village is wiped out. Yes.
Yes, but see, now it's more so now, it's the fact that AIDS is more, you can detect it now because we have the technology to detect it. But then people die now, you don't know what for people. Now it's more worldwide spread. Now we got technology to test it early. And that's what causes problems. Another, I don't know if it's a myth. I have a book set, AIDS Talks. I forgot what it was by. I really sat down and read it all, but it's a good book that I saw right then. I can read it when I show you. But also, I heard that science, you know how to go to other countries.
Yes.
You cannot, when you experiment it,
Yes.
it costs a lot. So we go to a lot of American scientists, go to other countries to experiment. I also heard that that's what American scientists are doing over there in the African time period. We go there and experiment. You got experiment animals. Back then, a lot of experiment on animals. And plus, just what was going on in Africa, you had people. I mean, it's like, I say, it's different how things go over there in America. So you have people experiment. You never know what was going on. And I heard that a lot of it happened from scientists that caused that. Created it. As far as that. And then that's the reason why if it wasn't those who champions, it was experiments on the monkeys. I mean, therefore, now, since they didn't have to justify the cause of this action, it created to American scientists for give them the bad name or whatever, because they let the singing in and didn't give them the rap, but we're coming back and try to fix it. That's how I feel. I mean, it's not fair, but back then, I mean, they didn't really have the right. They was going through, after back then, going through things themselves as far as in, among their countries. So,
Well, I was saying this, and I'm very glad that you brought this up because it's something that needs to be pointed out. There are a number of conspiracy theories that happen to abound regarding the origin of HIV and AIDS, and we're actually, in a way, predisposed to believe this because of some very unfortunate things that have happened in our past, whether it's in Africa or here in the United States. For instance, in Africa, there have been some cases where pharmaceutical industries that were doing research would do research that might not be considered ethical here. They couldn't get by with it because of the type laws here, but they can go to another country where the laws are not as stringent, and they can use practices that we would normally not approve of in their drug trials. So that's one thing that predisposes us to have great concern about that. Now, a second thing is the fact that the spread of AIDS was so prevalent in Africa and some other third world countries, as opposed to some of the more industrialized countries. Now, that may have something to do with a difference in the healthcare that's there, with the difference in the technology that's there. But thus far, there isn't yet concrete research to suggest that actually it was that's a man-made creation. It appears thus far that this is some type of natural viral mutation. HIV is a virus, and it appears thus far that it did in some case, in some way, begin with this group of chimpanzees and then become transmitted to Africans. Now, there has been a conspiracy theory that has been prevalent. Certainly, I remember hearing it back in the 90s when I was in college. Ladies, when I was in college. But the belief was, the concern was, that it was so prevalent in the African American community, even then, but certainly now as well. It was so prevalent that people will begin to think, had this been constructed in some way by the government or by some other group as an attack on us. Now, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, the first known case of HIV/AIDS in America was a white individual. So it's highly unlikely that it was constructed for the purpose of harming people of color. But nevertheless, and it has basically spread beyond the controls of any particular government. And normally, when you have biological testing, normally they try very hard to make sure that it's random, just in case there is some type of outbreak. You have to have some way to inoculate your population from the supposed enemy population, for instance, because you don't want that to get out of control. But another thing that predisposes people to believe that type of thing is the Tuskegee experiment of the 1970s. Anybody know what I'm talking about, the Tuskegee experiment? All right, sure enough, there was an experiment, a very unethical experiment that was done back in the late 60s, and eventually it was exposed in the early 70s by one of the nurses who was appalled that this was taking place when she found this out, that a number of African American males were being told that they were being given a vaccine, when in fact they were being injected with syphilis because the doctors wanted to test what the effects were of syphilis, what were the long-term effects. And so these particular patients over time showed terrible symptoms. They eventually fell into madness, which is an eventual outcome of syphilis. And so there were some who passed away from it. Now, eventually, this was exposed to huge scandal. And because of incidents like this, because of our unfortunate past, people are very predisposed, are very concerned whenever we talk about any type of new disease that seems to threaten so many people and whose origins that we've had such a hard time pinning down. So it's very important to engage our critical thinking and to research and to try to find out as much as we can so that we can investigate these myths and hopefully expose what the truth may be or happen to expose this as a myth. Thus far, there's not concrete evidence to suggest that any impropriety has occurred. Thus far, it appears to be a natural occurrence which has become a pandemic. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I don't know if this is medicine, but I was reading on the internet. Is it true that if you give somebody AIDS, you can go to jail or you know you've had it?
It depends on the laws in the area where that occurs, but if you knowingly transmit it, then it can be prosecuted.
Yeah,
it has been prosecuted.
Especially if you know this person has AIDS, which is why my cousin attended that school, and I guess a lot of charter school. They look for this girl because guys were reporting that we had contracted this virus from her. So they had it out, actually on her as well, to where if anybody saw her, please call the police and report. And that's basically what happened. And she had called the police and said, well, I see this girl you look for at my school. She's in the area, so she called them. And that's basically what they did out on the scene to go find her.
So what's the charge?
It's possibly attempted murder.
Attempted murder. And yeah, attempted murder, or attempted club bombing. It's just like any other.
And another important thing to say on that point is that we, of course, are aware of the statistic that there are as many as 1 million people living with HIV/AIDS in the United States, but right now it's believed that as many as a fourth of them do not know that, do not realize that they have it. And so even if we can hope that this person will have the integrity to tell us so that we can know to be protected, sometimes they really don't know. And so we have to make sure that we're taking precautions regardless. Yes, ma'am?
I have a couple quick questions. I just need to know. If a person, let's say a person does have AIDS and you're like the paper says, one person, you know. Basically, if one person has AIDS and the other one doesn't have AIDS, and you protect yourself, you're trying to tell me that that second person is not going to catch AIDS because
it is possible for people, it is possible. You have to be very cautious.
let's get very cautious, don't do it.
As they're taking medications and they're using safe sex practices, using a condom each time.
Okay.
So that's the important thing. But no, you never risk having unprotected sex with a person who is diagnosed. So you would be very careful.
And mosquitoes cannot at all.
Mosquitoes don't transmit enough blood or fluid to be able to transmit the disease.
And is it true if once, say, there's blood in the surface, the air kills AIDS? You know, surface.
It's not aerosolized, so it doesn't, to the best of our knowledge, it doesn't live long enough outside of a warm environment, for instance. So it tends to flourish inside the body. But like in terms of if it was exposed, say, on a toilet seat, for instance, it wouldn't last long enough to be able to transmit to another person. So that is one good thing. Thank goodness we can't catch it like, say, a food virus, which is aerosolized, where a person can cough and then people can get it. So it's not like that.
Can you help me understand how you can live with AIDS and not know HIV?
With HIV, AIDS should help.
There are some people who, I believe, like Magic Johnson, for instance, who was diagnosed with HIV. And I believe he is a carrier. I believe he was one such person, one of the very few people who was identified as potentially being a carrier, in which that person may live with that virus, but yet not contract AIDS. Now, it's possible that they can give that to somebody else who doesn't have their same immune system, but there are some people who live with it quite well. Now, one thing that is true, thank goodness, with the different cocktails, they call it, with the different combinations of drugs that many have to take every day, that allows them to live longer lives. So back in the 80s, we were seeing people pass away within a few years of a diagnosis. Now people live 20 years, 30 years, and so forth. They still have a life. And as one person that I knew who was diagnosed with the disease, the doctor was telling me that this is not a death sentence necessarily. And so there are some advancements that needs to be very hopeful.
Thank you. Let me just round this up by just on some taking food for thought for you to think about. We are now just finished talking about the U.S. Constitution, and we've also spoken about the uniqueness of democracy, and the uniqueness of the system of the government. One of the things that came out is we identified that there's some freedoms. America's individual freedom is allowed in the Constitution. Liberties, they call them individual liberties. And then they also allow for what else? Acting responsibly under the law, correct? The question now becomes, and it relates to your question about prosecution of people who will take other people with businesses knowingly. So the question becomes, now that we're confronted with this, how does it play itself with individual liberties and freedom that is allowed in the Constitution? Yes.
I remember when they first were talking about making it chargeable, there was a guy, I can't remember, it's been so long ago, who he was, but there was cases where this person found out he was had the disease, and he purposely went out and slept with people. And one of my friends, her friend was in Europe and had met a gentleman in a bar, went home with him, and the next morning she woke up and he was gone, but on the table next to her bed was a small coffin that said, "Welcome to the AIDS generation."
So you can see how devastating this is. It's making this disease as the internet and all these other new developments in our age, in our generation, is creating a lot of things that we have to sit and pause and think, look look at the Constitution again. Do we need a constitutional amendment? Do we need to make some adjustments? Again, that's the beauty of the American Constitution because it allows for the opportunity as we develop as a nation to make those adjustments and also make constitutional amendments. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is that we'll be having a series of workshops, symposiums, and other events throughout the school year. I think one of the biggest ones that we're still working on, Thomas and myself, we're working with people in Chapel Hill, is to bring a major production here. And we may want to talk to them.
Sure enough, NCCU happens to have a wonderful play, a wonderful production called Lonely Voices that happens to give a lot of great information about HIV/AIDS in a way that's very engaging, in some cases very entertaining, but it happens to bring out people's thought. And that's one thing that the arts kind of have the power to do, is to get people to really think very deeply about something. And that's when the arts are really at their best.
I would strongly encourage you to fully participate in these events that are coming on campus. It's not cheap, but we're doing everything we can to provide you with an opportunity to see and learn a lot about how to protect yourself from this devastating disease.
So this is a club, as far as a club,
No, this is a university-wide initiative.
No, I'm saying I can get involved. I'm just saying for the painting. It's not already started here, but I don't know. I didn't never know it started.
I'm so glad. Now, there are some groups, like for instance, at A&T, they have Aggies Against AIDS. They have several groups that are on different campuses around the University of North Carolina that happen to engage in awareness about HIV/AIDS. Right now, I don't believe we have a group that is specifically dedicated to that, but our Greek groups, our Student Government Association, AUTOS, which is the Commuter Student Association, basically what we're doing is a collaboration between these different groups in the Student Affairs Office at FSU to be able to raise awareness as much as we can about HIV/AIDS so that people will make those safer choices. And I hope, first of all, I thank all of you for coming and for spending your class time with us today to be able to have this very important discussion. I hope that you will all love yourselves and love your partners enough to assert your right. You have the right at all times to safe-sex alternatives. And we certainly don't want to judge anybody's choices. We're not judging anybody's cultures and practices. But whatever you choose to do, please choose to do it safely.